Good evening, everyone. I'm Michelle Major, formerly on the BGC faculty and now happily retired. On behalf of the director, Susan Weber, I'm very pleased to welcome you to this evening's Alumni Spotlight Lecture and introduce our speaker, Dr. William DeGregorio. I have known Billy, the formalities are over, as a student, a colleague at the antique textile and costume dealer Cora Ginsberg, and a good friend. This past September, Billy was appointed Associate Curator in the Costume Institute at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which was very exciting news for those of us at Club Ginsberg, but we are feeling a little sorry for ourselves after working with him closely for so long. Billy received his master's degree in 2012 with a prize-winning qualifying paper entitled Trompeuse Simplicité, Reconstructing the Oeuvre, Clientele, Personality, and Decline of Augustin Bernard, and his doctorate in 2021 with a dissertation entitled Materializing Manners, Fashion, Period Rooms, and Gentility at the Museum of the City of New York. While he was a student here at the BGC, I was very fortunate to have Billy as my research assistant and as part of the A team for my 2012 Focus Gallery exhibition, Staging Fashion. I think we truly bonded during the many hours spent trying to decipher the often illegible handwriting on the back of actors' postcards. From 2012 until his recent Met appointment, Billy was a research associate at Cora Ginsberg, and between 2012 and 2019, he was also a conservation technician at the Museum of the City of New York. Prior to beginning his MA degree, Billy served as a research associate in the Department of Textile and Fashion Arts at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. And between 2012 and 2015, Billy worked in various curatorial capacities in the Department of European Sculpture and Decorative Arts at the Met, the Department of Research at the Victoria and Albert Museum, and the Department of Graphic Arts at the Palais Galliera in Paris. Do you get the idea that he never missed an opportunity when he was asked to fill in? In addition to the 12 annual Cora Ginsberg catalogs, to which he contributed multiple entries on a wide range of historic and modern textiles and clothing, Billy's publications include a forthcoming essay on fashion in the work of the Paris-based American painter Julius Leblanc Stuart, in a volume on this artist, a symposium paper, 2 newly discovered Indian chintzes copied at the Oberkampf Manufactory circa 1774, that appeared in the proceedings published by the Musée de la Toile de Jouy in 2019, Hallowed with Memory, the Colis de Trianon collections and haute couture at the Costume Institute, published in Fashion Theory 2018, and Augustin Bernard, the Connoisseur's Dressmaker, in the FIT exhibition catalog Elegance in the Age of Crisis, Fashion of the 1930s, Yale 2014. Billy has presented conference papers at FIT, the IHH in Paris, and the Musée de la Toile de Jouy, and at some point next year, maybe he'll tell us when, he will appear on the Antiques Roadshow. As I was thinking about introducing Billy for this talk on his magisterial exploration of Percival Griffiths' early English needlework collection, its formation, private and public displays, and eventual dispersal, I recalled the first time he came to my office at the start of his first semester in 2010 and told me about his interest in Augustin Bernard. He talked about the fact that, although she was a highly regarded and well-known couturière of the interwar years, she had slipped through the cracks of the narrative of 20th century fashion. In investigating the story of both her success and her subsequent disappearance, I think he looked at every dress in US, British, and French public and private collections, consulted archives in New York and Paris, read every magazine article that covered her in American and French fashion magazines and other publications, and generally left no large or small stone unturned in documenting her design work and her career. And I can tell you that the French audience in Paris was very impressed when he presented a paper on Augustin Bernard a few years later. Here's this young American guy telling the French fashion historians about their patrimoine. The Augustin Bernard project was just my first experience of Billy's formidable scholarship. his extensive curiosity, his partiality to the things less studied, his phenomenal research skills, and his elegant writing. All of these are evident in his hefty volume on Griffiths, which I think began as a couple thousand word, whatever, essay, right? And which he will discuss in tonight's talk, the finest of its kind, Percival Griffiths' collection of early English needlework. Please join me in welcoming William DeGregorio.
Thank you, Michelle. That was amazing. So thank you, everyone, for coming tonight. Thank you to Susan Weber for inviting me, to Andrew for helping with organize all of this, to Michelle and so many other friends and colleagues I see here tonight. I very much appreciate you coming. And to the BGC also for basically giving me all of the skills that made this project possible. And I'm just going to launch right into it. So we're talking about Percival Griffiths tonight. Griffiths gives you just a sense of his biography first, so we get an idea of who he was. He was born in St. John's Wood in London in 1862. He was the fifth and last child of George Griffiths, who was a builder, and Maria Chevalier. And at age 18, his eldest brother, John, who was 17 years older, secured him a position as an articled clerk at the firm of Deloitte, Deaver, Hollybone, and Griffiths. His brother John had been a partner there since 1869. 10 years later, John sent Percy, he was known as Percy to everybody, to America to investigate the possibilities for business opportunities in a number of cities, including New York, Boston, Chicago. He went to Denver, Minneapolis, Philadelphia. So he was traveling all around America, scouting basically for the family business. And the firm ended up setting up a branch on Wall Street. He became one of two branch managers there. And it became a really big success in the 1890s. It expanded to Chicago, Cincinnati. It went to Argentina, Mexico, Brazil, Russia, Java, and it's still out there today. And this was all basically in the years before World War I. Griffith stayed in New York. He lived on Fifth Avenue and 47th Street for nearly a decade, and he was quite active socially, joining or even founding various clubs for hunting and polo in New Jersey and Staten Island, which actually had a very active British expat community at that point. And he was very social. So in 1891, he was involved in a little bit of a scandal. A woman named Margaret Della Brennan sued him for what was called breach of promise. This was not sort of uncommon at the time for spurned lovers, but she ended up suing him for $100,000. And it was not successful. But in 1897, he ended up meeting the woman who would become his wife, Gertrude Bailey Treddick, at a ball in Washington, D.C., and they courted for a year before marrying in the bride's hometown of Portsmouth, Maine, in 1898. She was 24 and he was 36. And the following year, they moved along with Gertrude's parents back to England, where Percy was now made a partner in the firm. So this was about 1899. He had an interesting family life. They had no children, the Griffiths, but Gertrude, I'll just go back here. Gertrude was very close with her first cousin, Marion Wendell. And Marion's husband died in 1911 after kind of having a breakdown. He had several different jobs and even tried to be an actor for a certain period, and had a breakdown, died in 1911. And so Marion was 41. She had 4 young kids, and basically Gertrude and Percy took her in, the whole family. So they all moved to the UK, the 2 boys, 2 girls, and a nurse and Marion. And they went to live with Uncle Percy and Aunt Bunny, as they were known. And these are the 2 girls. So they did very well for themselves. They were very beautiful. Catherine Wendell married the Viscount Porchester, who became the 6th Earl of Carnarvon, the year after they got married. following the death of his father, who's the Earl who funded the discovery of King Tut's tomb. They ended up getting divorced in 1936, and she ended up marrying several more times, and then the Viscount ended up marrying Tilly Losh. And 2 years later, Philippa married the 12th Earl of Galloway, and they ended up staying married. But I'm going to show you some images now. They moved to Griffiths' country house, which was called Sandridgebury. In 1900, they took a 99-year lease on this house, which was part of the Earl Spencer's property. It's near St. Albans in Hertfordshire. And it was a two-story house built at the turn of the 18th century. And you see here on the right, this is the house in about the 1930s, which is, if there are views that are known, this is the most typical view. And his mounting block is on the right there. But I mentioned that Philippa married the 12th Earl of Galloway. Well, the 14th, the current Earl, his wife, the Countess Galloway, Lady Galloway, recently emailed me and my co-author Chris to say that she had found, that she loved the book and had found some scrapbooks with photographs. So I'm just showing you these tonight for the first time. So this is a view of Sandridgebury from the gardens. And this scrapbook that she shared with us is from about 1907, 1908. And it shows a different side of Sandridgebury that we were not really aware of at the time we were writing the book, but I'll show you in a second. But this was where Griffiths really tried to establish the life of a country gentleman. He employed an unusually large staff for sort of his means. There were at least 14 full-time members of staff by the early 1920s, butler, cook, gardeners, chauffeur, the whole thing. R.W. Symonds, who I'll talk about in a minute, later wrote, quote, "He loved not only the 18th century furniture, but also the 18th century way of life. He had enlarged and converted the house from an old farmhouse, but not modernized it. It was illuminated by oil lamp and candles, and the only heating was from open wood fires. The bathroom had japanned baths dating from Victorian times. His bed was a four-poster bed with yellow curtains for the summertime and red for winter. And the house was not electrified until 1932. The household lived at Sandridgebury for the season from late July to November, when they moved to London, and they rented various houses in London, but their main residence in the 30s was Bryanston Square in Marylebone. And then they would go up to Sandridgebury on weekends and for Christmas. These are just some photos I wanted to show you, hot off the press, so to speak, of social life at Sandridgebury in the first decade of the 20th century. These are dated between 1907 and 1908. And you can see they hosted these pageants, and I haven't really, analyzed this material too much, but it shows a different side of Percy than we knew. And so Percy's on the left here, and there's not really a great photo of him anywhere, but this is about as close as we get. And Gertrude is in the sort of light outfit with the large hat on the right. So like all collectors, Griffiths had an origin story about his collecting. While staying at an inn in Monmouthshire around 1900, he had admired a mahogany bureau bookcase in the sitting room, and the innkeeper ended up agreeing to sell it to him for £40. And this was the first piece, the mythic first piece of old furniture that Griffiths bought. He later displayed this in the morning room at Sandridgebury, and he kept this for the rest of his life. But the majority of the purchases he made in the first decade of his collecting career were not kept. He was initially attracted to kind of very typical, I guess, Chippendale furniture, high style, kind of mid and late 18th century, along with some Queen Anne stuff mixed in. And I'm just showing you kind of an example of this here from Lady Galloway. But he was also a victim of the rampant fakery that was going on at the time. And there's a famous story that he would tell that he was in a shop in London one day, and he saw a mahogany table that was identical to one that he had recently purchased. And he went into the shop, and he noticed that it was £100 less than he had paid. And he talked to the shopkeeper, and he was kind of lamenting the fact that, oh, this kind of craftsmanship is lost now. And apparently the shopkeeper is supposed to have said, "It's not all that lost. Let me tell you, sir, that I made this table. And what's more, I've made in the last few years a large number of such pieces of Chippendale for an old buffer who lives at St. Albans." So after that, Griffiths began to seek the advice of this man, R.W. Symonds, who was a young aspiring architect. And he was the man who really helped Griffiths build his collection of furniture. And he shifted his interest from kind of high-style Chippendale mahogany pieces to earlier 17th century walnut. And he did have a lot of early Georgian as well. And I won't go into details about Symonds because the first volume is that my co-author wrote is full of information about him and his relationship with Griffiths. And I should also say that Symonds ostensibly had absolutely no interest in needlework whatsoever. His real thing was wood, and he was not interested in much else. So, which is all the more remarkable to me because I get the sense that Griffiths built the needlework collection essentially on his own. I do have a hunch that he was working with a particular dealer, but he didn't have this kind of scholarly, for lack of a better word, advisor working with him. But Symonds published many things throughout the 20s and the 30s, and I'm just showing you a few here of kind of the major landmarks along the way. And these are really the publications that built the reputation of the Griffiths collection, and it kind of took on, even by the 20s, this mythic status and the reputation of being the greatest, even then. And it was unusual because they were not obsessed with provenance or kind of virtuosity in terms of how elaborate pieces were. What Symonds' real obsession was surface and patina and color. And this is kind of the mark of the Griffiths collection and what has carried on even today as what people think of in terms of the furniture. So the emphasis was on originality, authenticity, warmth, kind of character. And before I get actually to the needlework, I just wanted to show you a few images of Sandridgebury, just to show you kind of how it changed over time. So these are these early photos from about 1907. This is, if you walked in the front door of Sandridgebury, this was the front hall. You can see here the hall then in 1913 and in 1930. And you can see it's both more crowded and less crowded, and but just kind of start to notice what happens on the walls, especially the morning room. And these are not one-to-one comparisons because the views are of different parts of the rooms, but I just wanted to show you kind of the difference over time. The drawing room, and again, the hall. So Griffiths, you can see, really treated needlework like paintings. He did not own paintings. He used them as art to cover the walls, and he was really one of a pioneering group of collectors who treated it, they were displaying it like this en masse. So it took on a really different character. There were collectors like the Viscountess Wolsey, Lila Helstone, Sir William Lawrence, who grouped their needlework like this and displayed it, especially up on the walls, treating it, and it took it from being a curiosity to a work of art. He also, if you can see here on the left, on the table on the far left, you can see that there are some glass cases. There's actually, in the low ones, there's cushions, and then in the higher ones, there's a casket or cabinet. You can see that on the right in the same photo as well. And then on the right, there's a few other glass cases with the needlework inside. And this is how Griffiths elevated his pieces. And he understood, even at this very early point, that especially dust was the enemy. I don't think quite understood the light aspect, but he must have, though, because the pieces that he took very good care of his pieces, and the pieces that he had when they were in his collection were really bright and vibrant for the most part. And then I don't know if you can see here, but trust me, in the image on the right, the table on sort of the right side up against the wall where you see the casket in a box. There's also purses laid out in front of it, just out on the open table. So that presumably these could be freely handled. And one of the major questions for me was why was there this interest in needlework at this point, or for Griffiths, and then extrapolating that out for others, and why this specific type of material, which is to say English domestic needlework. And this is, I really went into great depth in this in one chapter in the book that I'm quite proud of, actually, because I love understanding how particular classes of objects transform in status like that. And Griffiths really presided over the change in appreciation for this material that bridged the gap from because these are quotes, from grotesque to glorious. And I'm just showing you here this casket that came into the V&A in 1891 from the Zouch collection. And you can see why it might have had such a bad reputation at the time. There was the way that you would have encountered it most typically would be in kind of country house settings where it was one-off pieces, family pieces. You know, maybe you had a tattered kind of sampler on the wall or something like this out, but it took the collectors who were treating it who collected it in groups to really change the appreciation of it. I use this woman, who's great, Marian Alfred, as kind of the exemplar of what the prevailing attitude was towards this material in the late 19th century, which Marian Alfred, she was a fascinating woman. She was born in Italy and she was an artist herself. And she wrote this book in 1886 called Needlework as Art. And you can see she kind of starts at the beginning of time with it. And for her, basically the pinnacle, as for so many others in the late 19th century, the pinnacle of all artistic success was medieval. And it was basically all downhill from there. With, the Renaissance was pretty nice too. But from there, essentially, and she did not mince words. I mean, it's really colorful language that she uses to describe this stuff. Just one quote that I picked out, she wrote, English needlework around 1600, she said, was, quote, rich without grace and ingenious rather than artistic. These pieces, quote, astonish us by their quaint perfection and shock us by their naturalistic crudeness of design and the utter want of beauty or taste in the whole effect. So it was really considered, in the canon of artistic taste, if the pinnacle was, of course, painting for these people, then needlework was just kind of this bastardized form of painting that could never hope to attain any sort of artistic greatness. But if you were going to show textiles, what you would show would be ecclesiastical pieces. And so this is the South Kensington and then Victoria and Albert Museum around 1910, say. And this is what was out on display for textiles. It was ecclesiastical material. But it did start to change around 1900, and I've pinpointed this particular person and exhibition that he did. His name was Marcus Hewish, and he staged this exhibition in 1900 at the Fine Arts Society in London called the Exhibition of Old English Tapestry Pictures, Embroideries, and Samplers. And he was really the first to, he was interested first in samplers. And I think it was more for lexicographic reasons, for kind of the text that was on them. He was also a fascinating guy. He was mostly a Japanese art scholar, but he got super into samplers. And from samplers started to move into pictorial embroideries. And I'm showing you this sampler here because you can see where that kind of hybridity comes in at the top. There's this image, I believe it's the sacrifice of Isaac, if I remember. And so he started to become more interested in the pictorial elements of these samplers and then staged this exhibition. And I wanted to read you this. So these are two samplers, or two needlework pieces from Hewish's collection. And this one on the left from 1761, this is what he wrote about it, just as an example of how he would read samplers or needlework. Quote, For in no other example have we so many evidences pointing to it being a record of actual facts. For instance, there is clearly shown a gentleman pointing to his wife in a hooped costume, and having round him his 5 girls of various ages, the youngest in the care of a nurse. In the upper left corner is his son, in charge of a tutor, whilst on the right are 2 maidservants, one being a woman of color. This fashion for black servants is further emphasized by the Negro boy with the dog. That these should be present in his family is not remarkable, for by the lower illustration it is evident that Mr. Phillips was a traveler who had crossed the seas in his ship to where alligators, black swans, and other rare birds abounded. Unquote. So that's obviously, he's reading a lot into these, but the point was that he was taking these objects as evidence, and he was the first to treat them as evidence of material culture and material culture themselves. And this is even more true about the 17th century pieces he talked about. So this is what he said about the piece on the right. He called it one of the quaintest of the embroidery pictures, differing as it does from the majority of its fellows in the costume of its figures, and valuable as it is as a record of the dress of the first years of the 17th century. The piquancy and the variety of the subjects depicted combine with these to give it an unusual interest. As regards the dress, it denotes a period towards the close of the reign of James I. The ruff is still worn by the doctors, but the boots of the gentleman who walks with a lady are very close to the fashion of Charles I. The subjects combine the religious and the mundane. So he was really looking at these pieces for evidence of dress, for evidence of architecture, and also he was interested in how they show gardens and garden history and the kind of plants that were planted at the time. And this is one of my favorite quotes from him. He says, "In this respect, embroideries are hardly inferior as illustrations to pictures of Van Dyck or the engravings of Haller, whilst as sidelights to the horticultural pursuits of the Stuarts and of the flowers which they affected, they are perhaps more reliable authorities than the herbals from which it has been erroneously asserted that they derive their information." A little wrong there, but authorities on dress go to obscure engravings, or the brasses or sculptural effigies in our churches, for example, which have in every instance been designed by a man unversed in the intricacies of dressmaking. They have failed to recognize the fact that these embroideries are the product of hands which very certainly knew the cut of every garment and the intricacy of every bow, knot, and point, and which would take a pride in rendering them not only with accuracy, but in the latest mode. And this is kind of a pretty revolutionary thing to say in 1900 about the kind of evidence that you're getting from embroideries like this, which were essentially treated as, curiosities and the work of schoolgirls and not very valuable in any sense. And you saw he used the word quaint to describe the one on the right. And quaint was one of the terms that was habitually applied to 17th century English needlework in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, used to describe its charm despite its obvious technical deficiencies in terms of drawing and design. Naive, curious, and charming were also used to mark these products as outside the realm of canonical artistic judgment, and these words remained very popular throughout the interwar period. In 1905, Rachel Head, she co-wrote this book with Hewish, recommended 17th century raised work embroidery to readers of the Connoisseur by asserting, quote, "Its undeniable lack of beauty in the eyes of collectors is more than counterbalanced by the quaintness of design." And Margaret Jourdain, who wrote a very seminal book in 1910 about English embroidery, cited the overcrowded and illogical compositions as among the eccentricities that lent 17th century embroidery charm, but also marked it as decidedly amateurish. In the history of English secular embroidery that she published that year, she wrote, quote, "Some years ago, most people confronted with pieces of stump work would have used the words of Louis XIV, who, when 10 years' tavern scenes were exhibited before him, let fall the indignant and disdainful comment, 'Take away these grotesque things.' Opinion," she noted, though, quote, "has changed, and they are now considered both curious and valuable." And I go into this more in the book that humanity was really the appeal of these things. It was not about sort of artistic perfection, but seeing imperfection, and in that gaining access to the people who created it and to their time, about which was there was a big sense of nostalgia. So domestic needlework opened kind of a direct material portal to the past, specifically to the young girls who were imagined to have created them, and by extension, the values they exemplified, which were considered lost in the wake of the Industrial Revolution, and particularly following, all the trauma of the Great War. One reviewer for The Standard wrote of the 1900 exhibition at the Fine Arts Society, quote, "Quaint and pretty as many of them look, we cannot but think that their main interest is human rather than artistic." Noting that the exhibition was, quote, "really for women rather than men," he or she added, quote, "They with their touching or even funny inscriptions are records of departed personalities nobody would otherwise have heard of. Little lives gone down to the grave long ago with their quiet pleasures and their scarcely tragic griefs." Yeah, they're really good, all these quotes. And I'm only reading you a few, but there's a lot. Okay, here's one more. One writer for The Connoisseur wrote in 1907, quote, "There is something intensely fascinating about these old world embroideries, something which has nothing to do with their intrinsic beauty or with their age. It is the sense of human care and labor which have been spent upon them, the consciousness that they are the work of human fingers and have been the objects of thoughts and intents and aspirations, of heartbreakings and disappointments, of recoveries and the joyousness of success, of the gloriousness of work well done and completed." And there was also this obsession kind of with the idea of time and the fact that women had so much time, were imagined to have all this time, especially in the 20s and 30s when life was seemingly speeding up so quickly. There was this idea that even if we had the skill to, say, do this kind of work again, nobody would have the time. And I think, all right, one of the last quotes, Eugenie Gibson, who wrote several articles on Griffiths' needlework collection in the 1920s, wrote in The Connoisseur in 1925, quote, "In bygone times, women had few interests beyond their church and home, and long and lonely hours had to be whiled away in waiting for the menfolk until they returned from their various outdoor pursuits." So that gives you a sense of what was imagined. And it was really these virtues that these objects incarnated, kind of the religious devotion in all these biblical scenes. In the 1920s, again, this devotion to a king after having a long period of a woman on the throne. So there was kind of a patriotic idea about them. And also their devotion to love and to men. And all, there was this sense that these were created in women as they were preparing themselves for marriage. And in 1929, the Metropolitan Museum acquired several pieces of needlework from the Griffiths collection. I'm just showing you a few representative examples. These gloves that they were thought to have been owned by James I, a little psalm book, and many purses. In fact, Griffiths got rid of basically his purse collection in 1929 to the Met. And this was right around the time that Leighton Strachey had written Elizabeth in Essex, so there was a renewed interest in the Tudor and Elizabethan period. And Francis Morris, who was the curator of textiles at the time at the Met, wrote about the kind of cerebral connection that these objects opened up using these then current psychological theories that I actually really don't understand. But this is what she wrote. She wrote, "Such material in its very nature seems to retain throughout the centuries an element that cannot but awaken a deeply personal interest in the people of the age that produced it, an element believed by certain advanced thinkers in the field of archaeology to embody the persisting spirit of bygone days. This, if we are to credit their theory, has been unwittingly transmitted to the fabric from the mental attitude of those whose hands fashioned the work, and awaits only the quickening touch of the modern psychologist to reveal to us an amplitude of wisdom, romance, and intrigue." So I actually don't know what she meant, but that was current at the time. And this kind of idea of this intimate connection with the past and romance and intrigue is never more palpable than with caskets or cabinets. Because of this sense of interactivity with them, you can put yourself in the position of somebody who actually made or used them at the time. So they're inherently kind of, there's a connection there that opens up. And Griffiths owned at least 11 cabinets and boxes, major ones. He owned a lot of tiny little pieces as well, which he displayed throughout Sandridgebury. And they were among the most expensive of his needlework purchases, ranking highly with mirrors and beadwork baskets as transitional objects between furniture and pure needlework. So that was also the appeal of them. And I'm just showing you here this page from the Illustrated London News from 1928, when this casket was acquired by the V&A. And you see here, I mean, it's not front page news, but it was news. And the main attraction of this casket is that it had this model of a Stuart garden in the top. So again, that you're getting this material culture lesson in it. Boxes could be open, they could reveal things. And I think this will be my last long quote, I swear. But George Saville Seligman wrote Domestic Needlework in 1926, which was the big book, still very useful today, that was mostly on Griffiths' collection. And he wrote this kind of tactile, almost sensual description of what a transportive experience it was to open these caskets. And this is what he said. He said, "Silver pins, hairpins, buckles, brooches, and jewelry, no doubt, glistened within these nests of little drawers, especially in those concealed from view. The hidden ring drawer with divisions of red velvet is a usual feature, though in some cases it is exposed in the top compartment. Pieces of jewelry and loose gems have been discovered in these dilapidated padding of some of these caskets. Locks of hair are often found carefully folded in paper, and no doubt many a perfumed letter was cherished in those simple little hiding places." So I'm just showing you some of Griffiths' best caskets. This one, which is now in Minneapolis, it's great because it's dated 1662, very important date for royalists. And I'm just showing you here, it's a great photo because you can see the secret drawers in the back. So if you pulled out those three front drawers, you could pull out the little dividers in between, and those are the ring drawers that Seligman had mentioned. And this is one of the few objects that we know where he got it. He bought this in 1911 at Christie's and kept it for his whole life. It was in the sale of his posthumous sale at Christie's after he died and did not sell. And now it's in Minneapolis. But it has and it retains the wooden case that it had from the 17th century that was lined with marbleized paper. And this is probably why it's in such amazing condition. This is also just an amazing piece. I wanted to show it's essentially completely unique. It's in this technique called gum work, which is silk floss that's been glued down to paper, and then it's been cut out into shapes and then repasted onto more silk. And there's one other casket that I know of in a private collection, but it's nowhere near as elaborate as this. And there is also a secret compartment behind those three drawers in the center there. This box at the Met, when she was negotiating the sale of this box to the Met following Percy's death in 1939, Gertrude, his widow, said, quote, "There is no more brilliant and perfect box in existence," calling it the most beautiful stumpwork casket we know of in England. And I wanted to talk about this box because it showcases the idea of discovery that you had, especially with these pieces. Griffiths supposedly found inside this casket a number of objects which remain with it, including these 17th century playing cards that were folded up and made into silk winders. And the thing that was so interesting to Griffiths, and there were many other things in this casket. There are these ivory stumpwork tools, a spool of gold thread, bodkin, other various pieces. But the fact that these silk winders have the initials AP on them, Griffiths connected that to this mirror, which was also in his collection, that had the initials AP on it. And this is completely fanciful connection, but Griffiths certainly believed that they were done by the same woman. They had to be, because they had the same initials on them. And that this was kind of a great moment of reuniting these pieces for him. And the mirror was actually the most expensive item that the Met purchased in 1939. They initially wanted £400 for it, but the Met got it for £300. And also in that box, in addition to all those little bits, were found 2 series of letters. And one was a series relating to the purchase of another casket, his most elaborate casket, with the scenes from the life of Joseph, which I go into in the book because it showcases how he was going. He bought it from 2 elderly sisters in Devon in 1914, and how actively he pursued it. He basically agreed to buy it without having seen it, and it was a great, again, kind of discovery for us. And there was also a series related to the mirror itself in a very early hand describing all of the iconography of it, which was great. And Griffiths very jealously guarded these 2 pieces in particular. He never lent them during his lifetime, and he lent a lot of his pieces out frequently to exhibitions. So he really loved these pieces. I should say, though, that there's no one complete record of the Griffiths collection, which made compiling this catalog of trying to compile everything that ever passed through his hands very difficult, because there was no one moment where it was at its peak, or where we could say this was it definitively. So we had to work from published books and articles and exhibition catalogs, posthumous sale of his estate at Christie's, and a scrapbook, or an album, which I'll mention in a moment. But I wanted to focus on this key piece of evidence for us, or for me, which was this exhibition that was organized in 1913 by this man, J.W.L. Glaisher, who was a Cambridge mathematician and astronomer, but he was also a big collector of Asian ceramics, and then he was a collector of book bindings, and then he became a big collector of English earthenware. And just to show how quickly Griffiths assembled his needlework collection, so if he started to collect basically around 1910, which is what we think, by 1913, when this exhibition happened, he could loan 81 pieces of pure needlework to this exhibition. And it was quite a novelty to have this exhibition. I'm sorry, I should say it's at the Burlington Fine Arts Club, which was a very conservative club that was typically devoted to exhibitions of old masters and other very fine arts, clearly. And so to have this kind of exhibition, which was ostensibly dedicated to English earthenware, but which featured this huge collection of needlework of Griffiths, was rather progressive for them. It was on Savile Row, and it closed in the 50s, but Griffiths lent many exhibitions at the Burlington Fine Arts Club. And it just, it shows, when we looked at this catalog, we could already see kind of the character of the collection and how, and it retained essentially this character in terms of the composition from this early date. So the largest group of 53 pieces was pictures, and they were displayed framed on the walls, mostly biblical episodes. And I'm just showing you these 3 Abraham pictures here because he certainly liked to, I think this was his approach to collecting, especially pictures, was almost as a print connoisseur. He was interested in getting many different versions of the same story and comparing them, I think. Essentially seeing, what differed and the motifs that were constant. And, he never wrote anything, and I have no evidence that he was necessarily interested in tracking down print sources or anything, but he definitely collected, episodes and allegories and things like that in groups. And these are just some other pieces that were shown in 1913, at least one of his Charles I miniatures, this mirror with the 4 elements that was dated 1671, great basket now at the Wadsworth Athenaeum, dated 1662 again, and the amazing cabinet with the scenes from the life of Esther. there were also some of these amazing, extraordinary, and unique pieces that were displayed in 1913. And it's a revolving tape measure. So if you can see, there's a little piece at the bottom that you pull out, and as you pull it, the rose turns. And the measuring tape is inscribed with this inscription here, which you can read. So clearly intended as kind of a wedding gift or a love favor to somebody. And the fact that it was dated and signed essentially by the maker is amazing. And this is out there somewhere. We're not sure where, but the last time it did come up for auction, it was in rather awful shape, but it's still pretty incredible. He just had these weird, unique pieces. Like this is a stump work model of Adam and Eve. And he put these things in glass cases like this that I'm showing you too. And this amazing Bible with the scenes from the life of Elijah that he put in this elaborate case. And this was eventually purchased by Erwin Untermeyer, and Untermeyer kept it in that case, we know, in his home. So there's a whole thing about him and Untermeyer in the book. And this is a beadwork bellows that's at the Burrell collection with an image of Lucretia on the front. And it's also dated 1673. And you can see up in the photo on the left in the glass case, there's a sticker with a number in the upper left corner, 61. And this is the exhibition label from that 1913 exhibition, which we started to figure out when we started to correlate these numbers. And I bring that up because that image and all these images in black and white are from this album of Griffiths' needlework collection that he kept. It's the only one that we have, very luckily, for the needlework. There were others for his furniture, but those basically, Griffiths kept these albums to keep track of his collection and how much he was spending on it. He was the consummate accountant, which you will see in a second, and he would have had these albums for all of his other furniture, and they passed to Symonds. Those albums did after Griffiths died, and Symonds basically cut them up, and there are elements of them in his papers at Winterthur. But he was basically tasked with selling and distributing the collection after Griffiths died, so he basically cut them up to show people images of these things to buy. And but this one has luckily remained intact. And in the front cover, there's this inscription. Thankfully, it's signed by Griffiths. We have very few letters from him or any kind of personal correspondence. So this was nice. We have his signature, so we know we have his handwriting. And he gives this whole key for identifying the numbers in the album, about the negative numbers of photographs, and the short figures are pages from an inventory book, which would have been even more valuable, and unfortunately that is lost as well. And anyway, I'll just show you. This is how he kept track of everything. So he kept track. This book also has various other collections. It has his snuff boxes and ceramics and silver in it. But it's mostly needlework. And you can see, I'll show you a detail here. He started it on September 30th, 1927, and he inventoried his collection every year on September 30th until the year that he died. He died in December 1937, so right up till the end. And it was basically a room-by-room inventory of the house, and then to keep track of the pictures, the framed pictures, and then he broke things down by type later. But so here you see the hall and the drawing room as you would have encountered it in 1927, and then very few things changed drastically in terms of where he had them over the years. And this is page 1, and he very helpfully said this photographic inventory started September 1927. And I go into I've deciphered all of the numbers and all of the inscriptions and everything in the book, but the red circled numbers that you see on some of these, those are the executors going through after he died, keeping track of the things that had not sold during his lifetime. The white stickers are things that were sold in his posthumous sale. Probably they were going to get either a lot number or maybe a price realized in them at some point, though they didn't. And this is how he kept track of things. So you can see, this is the page with the bellows and also the amazing basket that's also at the Metropolitan. It shows you how much cost he had in things. So for instance, the bellows, he says, is 280 pounds, including case. So he had these cases specially built for these important objects. And he would then annotate if and when he sold them. So sold March 31st, 1932 for 377 pounds. He made a little profit there. But these pages weren't about recording profit or even where he sold them. So he never indicates where he sold things or to whom, but he also kept these little tallies on every page. It was basically about keeping track of how much money he had in these objects. So if something cost 280 and he sold it, he would cross out the 280 and then that would come off the total. And he did that every year. Let's see. And it shows us the collection basically as it existed in 1927. That's an important marker, but it also demonstrates a little bit of the distribution of the collection. So this one, you can see there's a box, a small embroidered box with Charles I and a very young Charles II. And this was given to, as he wrote in red here, given to Lord Garley's for a christening gift. And Lord Garley's was the 12th Earl of Galloway, whose son, the 13th Earl, was born in 1928, which is when he gave this to him. So this might be an object that actually Lady Galloway might find somewhere. I'm hoping. But then there are various things he would give away, and those are marked in the album as well. And then it gives a slight insight into some of his display practices. So I'm showing you here, this is an embroidered portrait of George Monk, who was kind of royalist hero of the 17th century. And on the left is how Griffiths originally bought it. So he bought it for 40 pounds, and then he had this simple silver frame built for it that cost 15 pounds, 10 shillings. So that's how much he had in it. And then he decided to move it to this frame, which was an antique frame from the 17th century, tortoise shell and silver. Originally, he had one of his Charles I miniatures in it, and he transferred it to here. So it just, and we also, you can see this change happen in some of the interior photos of Sandridgebury that we have in the book. So the album solved some mysteries for us, but there were many others to discover along the way. And I just want to end now with some of the more extraordinary objects that I was able to research and hopefully find a little bit about and contribute to their understanding. This is an object that Griffiths owned by at least 1917, and he wrote that year to the specialists at the V&A to ask about help identifying the heraldry. And it's an interesting piece because its provenance kind of teeters between whichever constituency you're a part of. So the English want it to be English, and of course the Americans want it to be American. It's called, we sometimes call it the Penn purse, or it's a letter case or a wallet that's associated with William Penn. The question is just which William Penn? Is it Sir William, the moderate Roundhead and parliamentarian admiral in the Royal Navy who captured Jamaica in 1655? Or is it the guy who basically founded Pennsylvania, known as the founder, William Penn? And there's been some debate about this, and of course Griffiths firmly believed in his time that it was Sir William Penn. They thought, okay, he's got a globe and he's got navigational equipment, and Penn was a great member of the Royal Navy. And also, I don't know if you can see it here, but the dog on the front cover has a collar that says Port, and Sir William captured Port Royal for England in 1655, so there was this idea that that connects. But And they thought that the coat of arms was the Penn coat of arms with that of his first wife, Margaret Jasper, who he married in 1643. But as I think I've proven extensively in the book, I won't go into it all, but I do think it is, this was probably made for the younger William Penn at the time around his marriage in 1672 to a woman named Julielma Maria Springett, who was a fellow Quaker. And these are their coats of arms. Basically, the genealogy is very muddy in general. Basically, Penns didn't actually have legitimate coats of arms. The Penns appropriated a lot of things and kind of created this heraldry for themselves. But it's more likely than not that this was made. It was certainly made in England, but it probably was made for the younger Penn. And this set of objects, I guess, this hawking set that was associated with James I, it's one of the most important items in his needlework collection. And like most of the other the most important pieces he sold to William Burrell through Frank Partridge in 1934. Griffiths himself had paid $1,100 for, Burrell paid £1,100 for it in 1934, which was, at the time, this is what he was paying to buy Degas. So this was a lot of money. And it was, the royal connection certainly helped. It was well published and exhibited in the time that Griffiths owned it, which I believe we know he owned it from at least 1926. But before then, nobody had ever found anything about it, and it was said to have been given by James I to a member of the North family of Roxton Abbey in England, which is where it was from. And then I was able to find these images and many different references to them going back to at least 1853 in various kind of antiquarian exhibitions that were going on in London, and actually in Ireland too. I mean, these were well exhibited objects. And I was able to find that this attribution to James I was, of course, it was kind of this game of telephone through the historiography. It got, from something like what he might have had to this was owned by him, this was given as a christening gift to this particular member of the North family. It just got more and more elaborate. But in the 19th century, when it was exhibited, there was no mention of this ever having been owned by James I. But it was a really interesting thing to research, particularly to go back to look at Roxton Abbey too as this, in the role that it played in growing kind of English antiquarianism in the 19th century. And I'm going to end now with this quote from Henry James, who visited Roxton in 1877, because I think it gives a sense of what Griffiths wanted to do at Sandridgebury himself, what he was trying to create by surrounding himself with these objects, and the particular potency of needlework, even though James doesn't mention it here. It's just the general atmosphere of these houses that these objects evoke. So this is what he wrote. "And what shall I say of the color of Roxton Abbey, which we visited last in order, and which the thickening twilight, as we approached its great ivy-muffled face, laid on the mind the burden of its felicity. The place is inhabited, kept up, full of the most interesting and most splendid detail. Its happy occupants, however, were fortunately not in the act of staying there. Happy occupants in England are almost always absent. And the house was exhibited with a civility worthy of its merit. Everything that in the material line can render life noble and charming has been gathered into it with a profusion which makes the whole place a monument to past opportunity. As I wandered from one rich room to another and looked at these things, that intimate appeal to the romantic sense which I just mentioned was mercilessly emphasized. But who can tell the story of the romantic sense when that adventurer really rises to the occasion, takes its ease in an old English country house while the twilight darkens the corners of expressive rooms, and the victim of the scene, pausing at the window, turns his glance from the observing portrait of a handsome ancestral face and sees the great soft billows of the lawn melt away into the park. Thank you.
We have time for some questions. Thank you so much, Billy. I just have two things that I ask of everyone. One, if you have comments, save them. We can go out into the lobby and discuss, and you can share your comments there. And second is, in the spirit of generosity, skip the preamble and jump straight to the question, and that'll make more space for everyone's questions. So does anyone have a question? Yes.
Thank you. I'm going to skip the preamble. Billy, hello. This is Catherine Whalen.
Hi.
Hi. So I loved it. That's my short preamble. I wanted to ask you, in the course of your research, which is really extraordinary, are there particular aha moments, or even beyond that, sort of switching points, things that you discovered that made you think differently about something that your interpretation you were working with, or just the material itself? The question is, were there any moments where you found something that you didn't expect that made you think about what you're looking at differently?
Well, I think one of the greatest aha moments for me was the Hawking set, and finding that, this has always been an incredibly important object. It's been at the Burrell since the 30s, and it's been well published, but nobody had ever found it in these old exhibition catalogs. And that was really the start for me to because that happened relatively early on, and I thought, okay, there's a lot more here to do. And this is just one of the objects that is like that. There's a whole group in the catalog of, I couldn't fit these objects into other categories, so I just called them extraordinary objects. And they're mostly extraordinary because they have really interesting histories that we can track. And that's very important to me, just as this is what the BGC hath wrought, is that I hate anonymity and kind of the fact that these things are thought of as anonymous or that they have no history. And it's like, often you can actually go find out where this object was 150 years ago, 200 years ago, and then find what people wrote about it at the time, reviews, or, there's so much to add to the histories of these objects. And that was really heartening, I can say. And then going into, that the album that's at the Met, the photo album was quite daunting at the beginning, and that took years to really begin to understand what it could actually tell us and how to interpret it all. But once I started to look at the numbers and, correlate them to documents I had found elsewhere, I said, okay, so all of these numbers in this particular place are the prices that the executors wanted for these objects. And I know that because this is the list that was sent to the Met. And so that was also a way of thinking about sources differently, and just how rich they can be if you have the luxury of spending years with things, then they can reveal themselves. So
thank you.
Thank you, Billy. That was great. I think a tribute to what the BGC can do for the field, and it's great to have your contribution to what's so many big questions here that you skirted in a way by dwelling on the details, which is great.
That's me.
But I was just curious about the relationship between this collection and the Untermeyer collection. That many of those objects were in the embroidery exhibition that Andrew Morrill and Melinda Watt did here in 2013, and so they've been on view at the BGC, and there's a tradition of them. And how did that happen? And is that one of the ways that you got engaged with this topic, or what are the connections here? Because now you're part of the story.
Well, so the Metropolitan is definitely the largest. So I didn't go into what happens to the collection after Griffiths dies, but he died, and there were several museums that were vying for it, who wanted it as a whole collection. It was basically the V&A and the Met, and I go into great detail about this in the book. There's great correspondence about this and how much each wanted it. And basically the curators at the V&A really screwed up, and Griffiths got angry with them, and he was like, they don't get anything. But then there was going to be a bequest, and that didn't happen. And essentially by the time that he died in 1937, the world had changed and the Depression was still on. So his widow did not really have the opportunity to donate it, or the ability. So it was decided by the executors, of which she was not one, that the collection would be sold. And most of it was sold at a large sale at Christie's, the Needlework. Symonds made it his mission that nothing of the furniture would leave England. So, and he actually accomplished that, except for one piece, which was the piece he sold Untermeyer, the bureau bookcase that is now in the Bryan collection in Chicago. But the Needlework was sold at auction, and Untermeyer bought pieces at that auction. He also had purchased pieces before then. And so I go into one of the things that I could get from the album when you started to look at the dates and when he was selling things was, okay, this was one campaign of selling, and this was another campaign of selling. And one of those big campaigns was around 1931, after the crash, so he needed money. And the beneficiary of that, the main beneficiary, was Untermeyer. And I don't know exactly what the connection was. It probably went through Frank Partridge. But Untermeyer bought a lot of needlework. And there's a bit of correspondence that actually Melinda cited in the book. So clearly, Griffiths and Untermeyer were aware of each other. It's not clear if they actually ever met, but there's a letter where Untermeyer says, "I'd love to come visit you." And he was asking for Griffiths' expert opinion about something. And so the Met is now the largest holder of items from the Griffiths collection through Untermeyer and a few other major collectors. But yeah.
Thank you. Wonderful. Thank you so much. I have a kind of general question here that goes into specifics as well. This is obviously a very male-dominated story and narrative, despite this needlework being a historically female craft. And so I was wondering here, two parts to this. One, because you went into detail about, if I'm getting his name right, Marcus Hewish.
Yes.
His female contributor. I'm wondering if she had anything to add here. What was her specialty?
Yep.
But also the second aspect of this is because you've mentioned that he was very much kind of not groomed, but trained into collecting furniture, but not into collecting needlework. Did his wife, perhaps, or any of the female influences in his life have any influence to that you can find?
Very interesting questions. Thank you. So Rachel Head. So there's a whole appendix that I wrote with other collectors. I wanted to create this kind of genealogy of collectors. So that's in this volume 2 of the book. And a lot of the early collectors and kind of people who were treating it in an almost scholarly way, like Hewish, were women. And I mentioned the Viscountess Wolsey and Lila Hailstone. You could even include Marian Alfred in that for other things, but just promoting needlework and an interest in it. And so there's in the appendix, I go through the sort of collectors who preceded him, and then kind of his contemporaries, and just a few that came after him and were maybe modeling themselves on Griffiths. And it strangely enough, it becomes a very male-dominated field of collecting, and I haven't really considered what the implications of that are, except that it becomes a connoisseurial thing, and therefore prices go up, and it's not so much an amateur pursuit anymore. And I should say that, so Griffiths he was only an accountant, but many of these other businessmen who also became kind of prominent collectors and philanthropists at the time, they were ennobled and they became sirs. He never did. But it was kind of an entree into a lifestyle. And clearly this is what Griffiths, he wanted to be a kind of country gentleman in the aristocratic tradition. And that's what he did at Sandridgebury. But in terms of Rachel Head, so she is in the appendix, and I know very little about her. I tried very hard to look into her. She co-wrote the book. She wrote the catalog for that 1900 exhibition, the portion that was about stitches, because she was a practitioner herself. She was also a collector, and Griffiths owned pieces that had formerly been owned by Mrs. Head. She had one of the Charles miniatures. She had a few other pieces. And she was an early writer in the Connoisseur and other magazines about needlework. But about the only thing I could find was these exhibitions she was lending to, that she lived in Bath. And I don't know much else about her, and I hope somebody really looks into her. And then in terms of his wife, there's some very fun things in the correspondence after he dies about how she basically says, this was not my thing. This was all Percy's love, and I had nothing to do with it. And so there were a few pieces that she felt a little protective over, but I mean, she sold everything. She really had it was his baby. So, yeah.
Hi, thank you. My question is, it seems like the people who are interested in this stuff were obviously interested in it partly because they were done supposedly by a young woman and were sort of considered like these amateur needleworkers. But it seems like some of the pieces in the collection might have also been professionally done.
Mm-hmm.
Was he or people in his circle like aware of that, and did he like differentiate between that and his own collection?
I think he certainly would have owned a few professional pieces. There's some of the tapestry woven pieces and book bindings and things like that. But for the most part, he was definitely attracted to that kind of amateurish quality, which I think that's this inversion that happens with it, is what made it so grotesque suddenly makes it so interesting and valuable. I don't think, and there were categories of objects that he didn't collect, which some other collectors did. He had nothing continental. He had no crewel work, kind of curtains and things like that, which many of the other collectors did. He didn't have really costume pieces so much. No, he had a couple caps from men, but no coifs and things, and very few gloves. The majority of the needlework is pictures, and those pictures are, I think they're all amateur domestic work. But that was the attraction for him. Sure.
I don't know if you can go back to your images,
Sure.
But early on in the talk, you had 2 shots of the same embroidered cask. And what I thought was extraordinary was a heck of a lot of 3D appearing. Earlier on. Yes, the right-hand side looks like 3-dimensional needlework was there. Is it indeed needlework, and is there stuffing underneath or something that made these figures seem so 3-dimensional?
Yeah, it's what he would have called stump work, which we more professionally say is raised work now. It's not a 17th century term, but I tend to use it. Most people tend to use it. And it's, this was one of the things that, again, in particular about the caskets was so attractive, and what Hewish and some other writers go into, which was that these women were essentially creating 3-dimensional, almost dolls on the surface of these objects. And that's why he got so interested in kind of the clothes they were wearing. And he had that quote about, go to these objects if you want information about fashion, because these were made by girls who were interested in fashion and who were there at the time, and not a man creating a funerary monument. So yes, definitely they are three-dimensional, and they're stuffed with some kind of wool batting, and those tools that were in the box at the Met are used to create that type of embroidery. So
please join me in thanking Billy DeGregorio for this wonderful evening.